Mike Tomlin doesn't lose his cool in public. That's why this moment caught everyone's attention. When a reporter asked Mike Tomlin about the development of Shedeur Sanders, his response wasn't emotional. It was cold, short, and final. No analysis, no praise, no criticism, just a firm shutdown that immediately raised eyebrows across the league. And that's where things get interesting. Because just months earlier, the Pittsburgh Steelers were one of the teams most closely linked to Shedeur Sanders during the draft process. Reports suggested real interest. Meetings happened. Conversations took place. And by Tomlin's own words, those meetings went well. He described Shedeur as tough, competitive, and mature, the kind of quarterback traits coaches usually don't hesitate to endorse. Yet when draft day arrived, Pittsburgh passed. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And after that, silence. No public clarification. No defense when rumors started circulating that the meetings didn't go well. No pushback when narratives began painting a very different picture from what Tomlin himself had said on record. That silence allowed speculation to grow, and now, months later, it's resurfacing at the worst possible time. Because this isn't just another matchup on the schedule. This is Shedeur Sanders lining up against a team that evaluated him, praised his intangibles, and still decided to go another direction. And now the head coach who once spoke highly of him is making it clear he doesn't want to discuss his development at all. That contradiction is what has fans talking. Was Tomlin protecting competitive focus? Was he avoiding unnecessary headlines? Or does his response signal something deeper about how the league truly views Shedeur right now? No one has answered those questions yet. But with this game approaching, one thing is clear: this moment carries weight. Not because of revenge, not because of trash talk, but because this is how NFL narratives quietly flip. And once they do, everyone suddenly rewinds the tape to see what they missed the first time. This game feels different, and not because of playoff implications or standings. For Shedeur Sanders, this matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers carries a weight that doesn't show up on a stat sheet. It's the kind of game players remember long after the season ends, because it represents something deeper than wins and losses. Months ago, Pittsburgh was part of Shedeur's draft story. There were meetings, there were conversations, there was legitimate interest. At one point, it looked like the Steelers could be a real landing spot. Instead, draft weekend came and went and Pittsburgh passed, not once but multiple times, quietly, without explanation. That alone wouldn't be unusual. Teams pass on quarterbacks every year, but what makes this moment stand out is everything that happened around that decision. Since entering the league, Shedeur has been surrounded by non-stop narratives, some fair, some exaggerated, and others flat-out questionable. His confidence gets labeled as arrogance, his toughness gets overlooked, and his development gets debated more loudly than quarterbacks drafted ahead of him. So when he lines up against a team that once evaluated him closely and ultimately said, no, it naturally turns into a measuring stick moment. Not a revenge game, a reference point. This is Shedeur showing in real time how far he's come since those draft meetings, how he processes the game now, how he handles pressure, how he responds when the spotlight tightens instead of fading. Games like this quietly reshape how front offices talk behind closed doors. And for the Steelers, this isn't just another opponent either. Mike Tomlin is one of the most respected coaches in football. When he evaluates a quarterback, people listen. That's why his past comments about Shedeur, praising his toughness, competitiveness, and intangibles still matter. And that's why the contrast between those comments and the draft decision continues to linger. Fans aren't expecting Tomlin to explain himself. That's not his style. But the tension exists whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Every completed pass, every broken tackle, every third down conversion becomes part of a silent conversation between player and evaluator. This game isn't about proving anyone wrong. in a dramatic sense. It's about showing growth in the one place that matters most, on the field, against a team that once had a decision to make. And the truth is, moments like this don't announce themselves as defining at kickoff. They reveal their importance after the fact, when people look back and realize this was the game where the narrative quietly started to shift. And once that happens, everything that comes next gets viewed through a different lens. What makes this situation linger is what happened on draft night. It's everything that happened before it. Leading up to the draft, there was real buzz connecting Shedeur Sanders to the Pittsburgh Steelers. This wasn't just fan speculation or social media noise. Reports indicated that meetings took place, evaluations were done, and by all public accounts, those conversations went smoothly. That's not opinion. That's coming straight from Mike Tomlin himself. Tomlin described the pre-draft visit as normal, productive, and professional. He emphasized Shedeur's toughness, competitiveness, and football intelligence, qualities that typically raise a quarterback's stock, not lower it. There were no red flags mentioned, no awkward moments, no hints that anything went wrong. And that's where the confusion starts. Because when draft weekend arrived, Pittsburgh didn't just pass once. They passed again and again. Multiple opportunities came and went, and Shedeur's name never came off their board. No explanation followed, no clarification, just silence. In the days after, rumors started filling that gap. Some reports claimed the meetings didn't go well. Others suggested teams were unsure how Shedeur would transition away from being coached by his father. None of that aligned with what Tomlin had already said publicly. But without anyone correcting the record, those narratives gained traction, especially once draft outcomes locked in. That silence mattered. In the NFL, teams don't usually go out of their way to defend players they didn't draft. But when false narratives start spreading, the absence of pushback often gets interpreted as quiet confirmation, even when it is. And for fans paying close attention, the disconnect between Tomlin's praise and Pittsburgh's draft behavior felt unresolved. Was it simply draft board math, positional priorities, another quarterback they liked more in that moment? All of those are plausible explanations. But because none were offered, speculation rushed in to take their place. And now, months later, that unresolved question has resurfaced, right as Shedeur prepares to face the very team that once evaluated him so closely. That's what makes this matchup uncomfortable in a subtle way. Not because Pittsburgh owes anyone an explanation, but because their early interest didn't fade loudly. It faded quietly. And in the NFL, quiet decisions often create the loudest narratives later, especially when the player on the other side of that decision keeps giving people reasons to look back and ask what changed. Mike Tomlin is one of the most disciplined voices in the NFL media landscape. He doesn't ramble, he doesn't speculate, and he almost never gives answers that can be twisted into headlines. That's exactly why this moment stood out. When a reporter asked Mike Tomlin about the development of Shedeur Sanders, the response wasn't emotional or defensive. It was sharp, brief, almost dismissive. Tomlin made it clear that Shedeur's growth wasn't his concern. He was focused solely on preparing for the opponent in front of him. On the surface, that sounds normal. Coaches say things like that all the time. But context changes everything. This wasn't a random quarterback. This was a player Tomlin had personally evaluated during the draft process. A quarterback he had previously praised for toughness, competitiveness, and intangibles. And now, when given a chance to speak on that same player's development, Tomlin shut the conversation down entirely. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans immediately picked up on the tone. Not anger, not respect, just distance. It felt intentional, like Tomlin was drawing a hard boundary around the topic. And when someone like Tomlin does that, people start asking why. Not because he owes anyone an explanation, but because he usually doesn't shut doors unless he wants to control the narrative tightly. Some viewers interpreted the moment as classic Tomlin, refusing to give bulletin board material or unnecessary praise before a game. Others felt it was more than that. They noticed how quickly he redirected the conversation, how little patience he had for the question, and how different it felt from his calm, thoughtful answers during the pre-draft process. That difference is what fueled speculation. Was Tomlin simply locking in on game prep? Or was he intentionally avoiding reopening old draft conversations that now look awkward in hindsight? No one knows for sure, and that's important. There's no confirmation of frustration, regret, or second thoughts, but the shift in tone was real, and fans felt it immediately. In the NFL, what isn't said often carries more weight than what is. Tomlin didn't criticize Shedeur. He didn't downplay his talent. He didn't question his future. He simply refused to engage. And when a coach known for measured responses chooses silence instead of commentary, it naturally invites interpretation. That moment didn't create a controversy on its own. It reignited one that never fully went away. Because when past praise meets present distance, people start connecting dots. And once those dots start forming a picture, every upcoming snap gets viewed differently. Which is why this brief exchange at a podium may end up being remembered long after the final whistle, not for what was said, but for what was carefully avoided. When the pre-draft meeting between Shedeur Sanders and the Pittsburgh Steelers finally became public, it immediately clashed with the narrative fans had been hearing for months. Because according to Mike Tomlin himself, there was nothing unusual about it. Tomlin described the visit as normal, professional, and productive. No tension, no ego clashes, no awkward moments. He emphasized that the conversation focused on football, how Shedeur processes the game, how he communicates concepts, and how he understands his own strengths and limitations. In other words, exactly what teams hope to see in a quarterback evaluation. What stood out most in Tomlin's comments wasn't praise for arm talent or highlight plays. It was the intangibles. He specifically pointed to Shedeur's toughness and competitive spirit, traits that don't always jump off the stat sheet but matter deeply at the NFL level. Tomlin even noted that these qualities showed up clearly on tape, suggesting they weren't just talking points, but observable habits. That directly contradicts the rumors that surfaced later. After the draft, reports began circulating that some teams felt Shedeur's meetings didn't go well. Others hinted at concerns about his background, his confidence, or the dynamic of being coached by his father. None of those claims aligned with Tomlin's own words, and that's where confusion turned into frustration for fans. Because if the meeting went well, what actually changed? To be clear, there's no evidence that anything negative happened in that room. No report has confirmed tension. No source has claimed Tomlin walked away unimpressed. The disconnect exists entirely between public praise and draft day decisions, and that gap is what allowed speculation to grow. In the NFL, silence often gets misinterpreted as confirmation. When teams don't clarify decisions, people fill in the blanks. And once those narratives take hold, they're hard to undo, especially when the player in question continues to develop under a microscope. Shedeur didn't get the benefit of neutral silence. He inherited a storyline that didn't match what evaluators had said on record. That's why this pre-draft meeting matters, now more than ever. Not because it guarantees anything, and not because it proves anyone wrong, but because it reminds people that the loudest narratives aren't always the most accurate ones. Sometimes the truth exists quietly, buried under speculation, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now, with this matchup looming, fans are revisiting those words not to argue, but to understand. Because when a respected coach praises a quarterback's makeup, then passes without explanation, it leaves one lingering question behind. If nothing went wrong in that room, Why did the story outside it change so drastically afterward? What made everything feel heavier wasn't the draft decision itself. It was what came after. Once the draft ended and Shedeur Sanders landed elsewhere, the Pittsburgh Steelers went completely quiet. No follow-up comments, no clarification, no attempt to correct the growing narrative that the meetings didn't go well. And in the NFL, silence like that rarely goes unnoticed. This wasn't just any prospect. Shedeur was one of the most discussed quarterbacks of the draft cycle. Every move he made was under a microscope, and every rumor traveled fast. So when reports began suggesting teams had concerns about attitude, fit, or background, fans expected at least some pushback, especially from a coach who had already spoken positively on record. But that never came. Mike Tomlin didn't revisit his earlier comments. He didn't reaffirm his evaluation. He didn't shut down the rumors either. And while no team is obligated to defend a player they didn't draft, the contrast was hard to ignore. Public praise before the draft, total silence after it. That gap is where speculation thrives. Some fans believe the Steelers simply moved on, focusing on their own roster and priorities. Others think speaking up would have created unnecessary headlines or distracted from their draft class. All of that is reasonable. But when a player's reputation is actively being shaped by outside voices, silence can unintentionally feel like agreement, even when it is. And that's what frustrated people the most. Because without clarification, the narrative around Shedeur began to drift. What started as draft evaluation chatter slowly morphed into questions about character, coachability, and long-term upside. None of it confirmed, none of it proven. But once those ideas are introduced, they're difficult to erase. The irony is that Tomlin's earlier comments painted a completely different picture. Toughness, competitiveness, intangibles that translate. Yet none of that was repeated once the draft dust settled. Fans were left to reconcile two conflicting realities, what was said and what was done. This silence didn't create the controversy, but it allowed it to grow. And now, with Shedeur preparing to face the Steelers, that quiet stretch after the draft has come back into focus. Not as an accusation, but as an unresolved chapter. One that never got a closing statement, only assumptions layered on top of it. In the NFL, narratives don't always come from what teams say. Sometimes they come from what teams choose not to say at all. And that's why this moment still lingers. Because unanswered questions have a way of resurfacing right when the spotlight gets brightest. This is where everything comes full circle. Because no matter how much teams downplay it, players always remember who evaluated them and who ultimately passed. For Shedeur Sanders, this matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers represents one of those rare moments where preparation meets context. Not revenge, not emotion. Opportunity. Shedeur doesn't need to talk. He doesn't need to gesture. He doesn't need to force anything. The entire point of moments like this is that the statement gets made snap by snap. Calm in the pocket, poise under pressure, command of the offense. The same traits that were praised in pre-draft meetings, now displayed against the very team that had to make a decision. And that's what makes this game quietly powerful. The Steelers don't need to regret anything for this moment to matter. They made their choice. They moved forward. But every front office around the league still watches games like this differently. Evaluations don't stop on draft day, they evolve. Coaches and executives constantly reassess players they once studied, especially when those players show growth in live action. This is where Shedeur controls the narrative. Not by playing perfect football, but by showing consistency, handling pressure without panic, taking hits and getting back up, making the right decision even when the play breaks down. Those details matter far more than box score numbers, especially against a defense known for discipline and physicality. And the irony is, this is exactly the type of stage that fits Shedeur's career pattern. Time and time again, he's been placed in situations where expectations were unclear and narratives were already written. Each time, the response hasn't been loud, it's been steady. That's what makes this matchup feel familiar rather than overwhelming. It's another checkpoint, not a crossroads. For the Steelers, this is just another game on the schedule. For Shedeur, it's a measuring stick, not against Pittsburgh specifically, but against the assumptions that followed him after draft weekend. Assumptions built more on silence and speculation than on what was actually said in those evaluation rooms. And that's the key difference. This isn't about making anyone look stupid. It's about reminding people that player development doesn't follow draft order, headlines, or early narratives. It follows opportunity, preparation, and growth. Because the NFL has a short memory, but it always remembers who showed up when the moment quietly mattered most. And games like this, they don't flip opinions overnight. They plant doubts, the kind that lead to reevaluation later, when people start asking themselves whether the player they once passed on has quietly become someone they underestimated all along. When everything is stripped away, the draft hype, the rumors, the media moments, what's left is a question that hasn't really been answered yet. How do NFL narratives actually get created? Because in the case of Shedeur Sanders, the story didn't turn on a single play, a single quote, or even a single decision. It turned on timing, silence, and perception. Early evaluations were positive. Meetings were described as productive. Intangibles were praised. And yet, when draft weekend ended, the story shifted without a clear explanation. That disconnect is what still lingers. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, passing on Shedeur doesn't require justification. Teams make decisions every year that look different in hindsight. That's part of the league. But when public praise and private outcomes don't align, fans naturally start connecting dots, even when those dots don't form a complete picture. And that's the danger of silence. Once rumors begin filling the gaps, they take on a life of their own. Meetings that were described as normal suddenly get reframed as questionable. Confidence gets rebranded as ego. Toughness gets overshadowed by assumptions. None of it confirmed, none of it proven, but all of it influential. Now, as Shedeur continues to develop on the field, those old narratives are being quietly challenged. Not erased, challenged. Because growth has a way of forcing reevaluation, especially in a league where opinions change fast and memory is short. This upcoming matchup isn't about revenge. It isn't about making a point. It's about context. It's about what happens when a player walks into a moment carrying unanswered questions and lets performance speak where words once fell short. And for the league as a whole, including the National Football League, stories like this are a reminder of how fragile perception really is. One off-season narrative can follow a player for years if it's never clarified. One stretch of silence can outweigh multiple positive evaluations. The lingering question is whether the Steelers made the right decision. It's whether the story that followed that decision was ever truly accurate in the first place. Because if Shedeur's trajectory continues upward, people won't just revisit draft boards. They'll revisit assumptions. They'll rewind interviews. They'll rewatch moments that were overlooked. And they'll start asking how much of what they believed was shaped by facts, and how much was shaped by what went unsaid. That's how NFL narratives quietly flip. Not with headlines, not with apologies, but with time, growth, and the uncomfortable realization that the truth often lives somewhere between what was spoken and what everyone assumed when no one filled in the blanks.